Thanks for being here. Welcome to this year's workshop on international survey methods. We have a really nice lineup so far for the fall. Next month, Chris Aiken will present, and then we have talks, also presentations in November and December, and we have a few things in the works also for the spring, so stay tuned and come back. I will let Luke introduce Hannah, today's speaker, and we can get started.
Yeah, so we have a great presentation to start off this semester. Dr. Hannah Ridge, she's a postdoctoral scholar at the Posen Family Center for Human Rights at the University of Chicago. And in an effort to get, a more international base, we tried to recruit people doing work from a variety of regions. So she's going to be showing us some work on surveys in Israel. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Thank you, Luke. I'm going to see about sharing my screen. There we go. Which hopefully means you are all now seeing a PowerPoint.
We are.
Great. Okay, so as Luke just said, I'm going to be talking today about conducting political attitudes or sort of generalized surveys in Israel and what it means to be conducting surveys on the Sabbath. So there's lots of areas in political science where we think that religion matters, and that includes citizens' religious identities and includes their religious beliefs and also religious participation. And we've looked at this often using survey techniques. Another thing that's been taken into account in some of these, particularly people looking for more causal narratives, is to look at exogenous survey cues or religiosity cues. Some of that's done by intentionally priming religion on the part of the researchers. But it's also evident sometimes if you look at researchers exploring ambient religion in society. However, we're less likely to take into effect in a generalized survey design, one that's not experimental, the role that ambient social religion plays and the cueing effects that it can have. And I want to argue in this piece that researchers actually do need to be mindful of that because it's going to have effects in ways that we can't necessarily predict. So several researchers have tapped into the role of religion and religion timing in all sorts of research. And a lot of this has been done in Islam, but also to a lesser extent Christianity. In Islam, it's frequently exploited, particularly because the lunar calendar allows you to get around certain time invariant factors to look at the effect of religion using Ramadan and Ashura as major holidays. But there's also been studies that look at the role that religion and its position on a Friday plays in Islam on behavior politically in the Middle East. Less work has been done on this in a more observational sense, looking in Christian majority contexts, and either looking for effects from events like Easter, or just looking at whether or not people behave differently or feel differently on Sundays. And so I'm taking that approach, but I'm looking at it in the context of Israel and the Jewish Sabbath, which is particular in a few ways, one of which is because I'm looking at this in a non-exploitative context. I'm not looking for it with specifically intending to prime religion, because I want to look at what effect this general pattern has, but also that the Jewish Sabbath runs sundown to sundown, which means it starts partway through the day on Friday, especially preparations for the Sabbath, which would start kicking in businesses closing and people preparing evening meals and preparing for prayers. And it runs through the day on Saturday, including often when people would attend temple and about when observant Jews would abstain from work to varying degrees. And so what you see in Israel in some studies, of course, is that some businesses and public services are closed, but also that we see manifestations in a few studies that suggest things like there's fewer traffic accidents and actually reduced mortality related to Sabbath. And I want to explore this because what we could find is that the ambient religious cue that is happening from a religious day occurring, but also from the religious day taking on social significance and influencing society at large in a Jewish majority context, and in fact, the only Jewish majority country, that you could see religion and religious identity becoming more salient because of this sort of ambient prime. It could also highlight the Jewish character of the state of Israel. Another thing I want to explore is the potentiality for this being something that particularly matters for religious Jews rather than hitting all the Jewish respondents equally. because there is a discrepancy in some ways in Israel with there are people who identify within Judaism as Jewish because they are religiously Jewish. And there's also people who are ethnically or culturally Jewish, but may not participate in Judaism as a religion. And so to do this, I turn to one of the more recent waves for Israel of the European Social Survey. There is another wave that is slated to come out this winter. And this European Social Survey uses strict random probability sampling, and I'd love to exploit the sort of randomness of that. But in particular, the protocol does say that the surveys have to continue, or at least some of them have to occur in evenings and on weekends, which meant that they were going to include the Sabbath in there. 75% of the sample is Jewish. I'm going to focus my analysis on that portion of the population because even though the next largest religious group is Muslims, followed by Christians, then there is the Friday effect. It's not quite the same, and they would be living in a minority context, which I think would behave differently. Because they're using this random probability sampling, we do find, and I can show you this in the appendix if people are interested in it, that assignment to treatment, which would be taking the survey on the Sabbath, is plausibly exogenous to a large number of respondent demographic characteristics. So we can actually look then at sort of the Sabbath effect without necessarily seeing something that is being done that's priming religion, but that is also a function of these other features. Another interesting thing about the dates where this survey was occurring was that Hanukkah happened during the surveys. And in that case, Hanukkah is not, as America might sort of make it seem, some sort of Jewish Christmas. It is still a religious event insofar as it relates to the rededication of the temple, but it's also part of, in some ways, national liberation narratives because it celebrates a successful revolt. And so it plays up in sort of two ways in the Israeli ethno-nationalist context, but it's not necessarily as overtly religious as the Sabbath would be. But because it's in the sampling window, I wanted to look also for Hanukkah effects. To identify whether or not respondents are more or less religious, I include two metrics. One is whether or not the respondent says that he or she attends religious services weekly. And the other is whether on a scale of 0 to 10, he said or she said that she identified as religious. And because I don't come into this with ex-ante expectations of what the Sabbath is going to do to citizens' political beliefs, I cast a very wide net from among the questions that the ESS asks. And so some of these look at questions of egalitarianism or equality. And we can talk in the Q&A if people are interested about how some of these things might relate to Jewish law or ideas of religion or culture and politics. But for now, I'm just going to go through sort of briefly what they are. One is the idea of whether or not men should be privileged in employment over women, also whether or not gay and lesbian couples should have the right to adopt children, whether or not people coming to Israel should have access to social benefits and when, whether or not people believe that it is important for someone to be everybody in the world to be treated equally, and then also questions about their attitudes towards refugees. This is saying refugee, it's not referring to immigration writ large, in which case Israel would have the right of return, potentially influencing the policy. And so one question is, should the government be generous in construing a refugee petition? And the other is whether or not they think people making these refugee claims are telling the truth about their fear of persecution. I also look at some questions related to interpersonal trust, and two questions that are not about prospective political beliefs, but are actually retrospective evaluations of the person's experience in Israel, whether or not this person has felt that they've been a victim of discrimination and whether or not they felt they were discriminated against on the basis of their religion. These could behave differently because they are sort of memory-based. And so on one hand, your past wouldn't change depending on when you took the survey. On the other hand, you may remember your past differently. And so for the scale questions, I just keep it simple. I use OLS and I do include the ESS survey weights. For the questions about discrimination, these are going to be LoJIT models that also include the survey weights. As I noted, this is in theory a plausibly exogenous assignment of treatment about when they're taking the survey on the Sabbath or not. So I could run the models with or without the covariates. For the purposes here, I'm showing you the models that include the covariates, but that I've suppressed them for the sake of a wall of numbers. We can talk about them in the Q&A if people are interested. And so when we look at these models on whether or not women should get equal opportunities for employment, We don't see a direct Sabbath effect, although we do see that people who identify as more religious or attend religious services are more likely to privilege men in employment. And we don't see an interaction, though, between the Sabbath and religiosity either. When we ask about whether or not respondents think that gays should be forbidden from adopting children, again, we see that the people who identified as religious or attend services more often are more likely to say that there should be restrictions on homosexual couples adopting children, but we don't find a direct Sabbath effect there either. So maybe it's okay. And then this is where we actually start seeing why I'm casting a really wide net, is that not everything behaves the same way. When we start looking at the more questions, whether or not, for instance, people who immigrate to the country should have access to the welfare system, people who took the survey on the Sabbath thought that they need to wait longer. And if we look at whether or not this person identifies with the idea that people should all be treated equally, we don't find a direct effect of religiosity or the Sabbath, but we actually do find an interaction effect between the idea of taking it on the Sabbath or not. And what's happening here is actually that people who are themselves more secular express more egalitarian attitudes when they take the survey on the Sabbath than people who are themselves identify as religious. And those people give roughly the same answer, whether or not they're taking the survey on the Sabbath. So they might seem actually to sort of perpetually prime. In terms of greater levels of interpersonal trust, we again don't see a direct effect of the Sabbath, but we see this interaction effect here. And what's happening is that people who are not attending religious services, if they take the survey on the Sabbath, report lower levels of interpersonal trust, whereas people who attend the services regularly report higher levels of interpersonal trust on the Sabbath. So the Friday, Saturday survey takers have a greater disparity in their levels of interpersonal trust. And now we get to the questions about how you should treat refugees. Should these things be construed broadly or narrowly? We are seeing in this case a direct effect, both from religiosity and from taking the survey on the Sabbath, where we see these people who took the survey on the Sabbath are expressing more trusting attitudes. But we also see, right, that this is again one where we're seeing a separation between the religious and the not religious and how the Sabbath effect is mattering for their results. And where we see actually the people who are regular attenders are even more likely to say the government should be generous in its interpretations when they take it on the Sabbath. And then when we ask, though, about whether or not they think the people asking for refugee status are telling the truth, we actually see the effect is concentrated largely among the people who are not regular participants in religious services, in which case they become more trusting because they took the survey on the Sabbath. And so we're seeing a lot of very different responses, not all direct effects, but sometimes we're seeing amplifying effect. What we aren't seeing here is any effect when it comes to now analyzing your sort of retrospective evaluation when people are thinking about their past experiences of discrimination. In that case, we're not seeing direct effects of the Sabbath or a separation on the attitude expression or their expression about their past related to their level of personal religiosity. And so looking at this and sort of thinking about how wide a net I cast and the sort of heterogeneity of the response patterns is I have a couple conclusions, and they're tentative conclusions because this is a pretty early stage project. One of which is this might matter in real life because in some countries, people vote on the weekend, which means they're voting in some places on the Sabbath. For instance, in the US, there's actually concerted efforts by religious communities to get people to go straight from church to the polls. And so if the fact that it is a religious occasion is actually changing how you are thinking about politics, you might actually be getting people to vote differently on ballot measures and things like that by taking them straight from religious observance to answering that question. In Israel, beacon polling is not really done. The elections are usually on Tuesdays, and only people who are voting in sort of remote contexts usually get a very long lead up where they can vote absentee, which would in theory mean that most people are not going to be primed this way in Israel on that question, but it leaves open the question of how this is going to matter in other countries. In terms of how we then handle this from a survey perspective, is there's not a clear sign that I can say, well, it's just going to raise your numbers or lower your numbers in a direct fashion, which means you can't come into this with an ex ante expectation in subsequent surveys about how this matters. On one hand, that including therefore the Sabbath in your survey sample increases the reality of it. You're taking into account that this is a thing that actually happens, and in some parts of the week they feel differently, and you're going to include that. But what that does mean is that it's effectively an additional treatment in your model. And so if you're only doing a short sort of one-off survey, I would suggest not doing that survey on a Saturday, because you're going to fundamentally get different responses and have your responses all be in a treated case in a way that you don't mean. And because there are, for some instances, heterogeneous effects between the religious and the not religious respondents, it's not a stable treatment across all of your respondents. And so if you're going to try to factor this in, I'd say to be very strategic about survey timing. And other ways to go forward, I'm of course looking forward to the next round of ESS, because it's going to ask questions about nationalism, democracy, and authoritarianism. And that's really my home area, which means I'm really looking forward to seeing if people feel differently about nationalism and democracy, if they're coming into it with this religious prime, particularly in a country that has a lot of questions about the role religion should be playing in the state. I'd also be really interested in finding surveys that tap more into the question of major holidays. I told you that Hanukkah is in the sample, but it didn't really appear in my results discussion because actually Hanukkah does not have a very sizable effect. When people answered the questions about egalitarianism, they were more egalitarian during Hanukkah, but none of the other results reflected sort of the idea of it being a religious holiday, and that wasn't changing people's results in a significant way for most of the question. So I wonder if we tapped into a different holiday that had necessarily more overt religious significance, you might see a bigger effect. I'd also be interested in exploring this in panels looking at American Jewish respondents, because then you'd be talking about people in a Jewish minority context. And so it's just a different frame to analyze that perspective. But LAPOP is hosting us, and I don't want to leave them out of that conversation. LAPOP surveys run on Sundays. And so if anyone's really familiar with the LAPOP data, I'd love to talk to you about maybe doing a LAPOP-based parallel, because there's a lot of opportunities then to look for Sunday effects and to exploit the growing evangelical population in Latin America to see if we're actually going to start seeing differences between evangelicals and Catholics with response to this sort of religious prime that doing a Sunday survey would include. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and open the space to some questions and comments. As I said, this is sort of a new paper, so you have a lot of opportunity to influence what I do. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hannah.
I'll stop the screen share unless I need to pull up the appendix slides, and then
Okay,
I'll bring it back.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for that presentation. That was an interesting study design, and some of the findings were, kind of thought-provoking. And also I like that it offers us something to think about in terms of practical surveying for us at LAPOP and for others, I'm sure. Yeah, so you can post questions in the chat or raise your hand, as I see some people have already done. And we'll go in the order received. So Noam, do you want to start us off?
The Israelis raised their hand. I don't know, Hannah, if you know Avital.
Yes.
So this is really interesting, and I'm intrigued by the Sunday idea. I guess what I want a sense of is whether it's actually the Sabbath that's doing the work. So it seems to me like there's a confounding factor, which is it's the weekend. So there's two ways that could go. One is, people feel differently about everything on the weekend. I know I do. Right. So, you're not working, you're spending time with family. There's all sorts of sort of non-religious elements to the weekend that, could be what's driving the result. The other possibility is that the makeup of the sample is different on the weekend than it is during the week, right? And that's why we do surveys on the weekends, because we think people who work and especially people who work long hours are going to be harder to reach during the week, and so you you kind of, the reason we do surveys on the weekends is because we do expect the sample to be different, right? And so if the sample is different, then you might find sort of, these kinds of attitudinal differences. So I was trying to think about, I mean, I don't think you have enough N to do something where, you sort of compare, right, Saturday to Friday or something like that, right? And, the weekend in Israel on Friday is a little bit, I mean, many people also have Friday off, but many people don't. If I were looking for something similar in Latin America, I might want to compare just Sunday to Saturday, right? Because, sort of control for the weekend effect or something like that. I mean, even so, it's a little imperfect because, some people, the second day of the weekend might feel different than the first day of the weekend. But yeah, so anyway, I guess it's sort of a comment, but, if you've thought about this and have any ideas about, how to address that.
So I did think about that, and I wondered about it in a way. Most of the studies, when I said, for instance, that there are studies that are addressing, people's sort of feelings on Sunday and things like that. Most of them are things like your general life satisfaction. They assume that you can handle the weekend effect by looking at whether or not someone is employed. And so that's how that's been done. I don't know if that's 100% capturing it really, because of course other people are also changing their behavior. This is sort of the model I used to look at just sort of like assignment to this treatment. And the demographics I was able to pull from ESS to sort of look at whether or not there were differences. The only real difference was that Jews were less likely to be taking it on the Sabbath than for instance, the Muslim or Christian citizens. Otherwise, but then I focused the analysis in on the Jewish population anyway. I did run the model sort of with a Saturday only, and the results are about that. I didn't run it with a Friday only, and I can check that.
Avital, do you want to jump in, or did Hannah?
Sorry,
Did you have more?
Make sure I'm hitting all of those items. Yes. Yeah, so
yeah,
in that sense, yeah, I don't know fully if it's going to account for the weekend nature of it, but at the very least, I don't find real differences, and I think that that's partly owing to the fact they're doing surveys also during the week after work to get some of those people in there too. Avital?
Yeah, my question is very much in line with what Noam just asked. But rather than thinking about weekends and people having fun, I keep thinking about people who are like observing the Sabbath and therefore in no way willing to take a survey. You could say that that's kind of potentially setting up a harder case to find some of the results that you're finding. But some of the results, not all of them, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about like who self-selects out of the potential sample on the Sabbath because of, right? I think it's a non-random sampling constraint here that I'd want you to think a little bit about. Just availability. And there, I know you use a lot of ESS data, maybe you work closely with the ESS Israel team, but it could be interesting to ask, like, I personally would be avoiding religious neighborhoods if I'm out trying to canvass on a Saturday. And so just to see a little bit about how do they handle the sampling process on a Saturday is something that I would want to know more about. Yeah. And then thinking about whether this is like helping or hurting your case, I think is a thoughtful thing. Just like Noam's question about the weekend effect, whether it helps or hurts your case, I think is valuable.
Yeah, so I haven't asked them about how it influenced their protocols. I mostly just looked at their descriptions of what they did, which didn't reference that, but I can actually just reach out to them and see what they did, because they would know. With respect to the really devout, so I wish they'd had, because a lot of these questions are the ones that are used the same across all of the ESS. They don't have something like are you Hasidic kind of binary, which would have been great, because those are the definitely ones I would think like would be opting out. That's part of why I looked though at the sort of self-identification as religious and not just sort of the service attendance. And I didn't find sort of that difference across treatment groups to see them not doing it. What it does make me think is that I'm not going to find any like Hasidim in the survey taking population, because that would be working. And I don't know if they would necessarily think doing the survey was work, but taking it would be, right? Like you're going out to people's houses and door knocking, all those things you can't do. And so whether or not that would do it, but I thought about
the hard
that.
thing
but I
is
also
that
think
the two things are going against each other, right? You're arguing that maybe people are being primed to say that they're more religious because it's Shabbat, but also, so those that are being surveyed are saying that they're more religious, but the really religious are not taking the survey. And so the fact that you're not finding a difference, it's not clear that it's fully addressing some of the concerns that I'm raising, because if the population that is being surveyed is self-identifying as more religious, but the really religious are just out of the sample, it's going to be hard to see that from the sample itself. I would strongly recommend reaching out to the ESS Israel team to talk to them about this, because again, if I were just a Joe Schmo surveyor on Saturday trying to get people to answer my survey, I just would avoid religious neighborhoods. I would know that it would be just a waste of my time.
Right, so I don't see, at least on the like a significant correlation in terms of like they're saying whether or not they're religious. I would have liked if I had something I could have said, oh, like a Hillel had binary or something, like that they had that kind of question, which I think if it weren't a generalized Europe survey, they would have had. But I think my biggest concern in that front was actually saying is like, well, the, Hasidim or something aren't going to be ever the people, I don't think they're ever in the survey, like taking side of it, like the ones who were giving the survey. Sorry, I'm using giving and taking both ways, and I shouldn't do that, because you wouldn't take a job that would say explicitly you're going to work Saturday. So I would think that this people who are administering the survey are probably all much more likely to be in the half the population that identifies like as Hilonai. And in that case, I think about it, but at least in that case, in terms of whether or not it creates a generalized pattern. So if I were just using the ESS data, I would think that might create a generalized, hey, the person asking this is probably going to look secular. But because we know from surveys in like the Muslim world, looking religious can change how people answer the question. But if I think that it's going to be the same across all the days, then I don't know if that would be itself different on the Saturday. Like, am I going to respond saying, well, I just went to temple, but now this secular woman came and is asking me questions? Like, and I don't know, but I can definitely ask them, did you guys specifically avoid certain neighborhoods when you were fielding the weekend surveys? Or did you actually just say, well, it's going to be harder, let's target the Palestinians or something, which also may have been what was going on, because only 75% of the people who took the survey in general were Jewish, and only about 5% of the surveys done by Jews were on like the Sabbath. Then again, they powered through Hanukkah, so it's hard to say what kind of choices were necessarily being made that way. So yeah, I think asking them might be the answer. Is that a second question?
I did have a response to Noam's concern about the weekend effect. So Hanukkah is not very religious, but it is a holiday. Most people are off of school and some people are off of work at that time. And so because the kids are out of school, most people take off work that week. And so because you're finding null effects on Hanukkah, you can say like it's not a vacation weekend effect potentially, as much as it's maybe a religious thing, because that's I think a bigger difference between the Sabbath and Hanukkah as a religion. Or maybe they're just so like full of oil that they can't think straight. I don't know.
Too much.
Yeah, so if I could find like a Rosh Hashanah survey or Yom Kippur, survey, that'd be really cool. But on the other hand, I also think that that'd be like waiting for someone to do a survey on Christmas, that people actually, it's going to be too important, no one's doing it, everyone's got, they often no one is taking surveys. And so it'd probably be the strongest treatment, but it's the least likely to transpire.
The hard thing is you want to find a holiday that is religious that people are allowed to work on, which is a very, very tricky thing, right? So that you wouldn't have this people opting out of the survey. Like in a way, Hanukkah is great because people can do whatever they want on Hanukkah, but that's exactly why it's not a very religious holiday. So I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head, like Shavuot, maybe.
Yeah, so I can check that. I have to check sort of which waves, because it also the survey I have the benefit of it sort of rotating, and just sort of looking at what happens to align during different dates. I would have assumed that they were going to avoid any of the holidays, and I just felt lucky that they had Hanukkah in the window and didn't stop.
Does the National Election Study survey on Saturdays? I mean, is the ESS the only?
It might. I'll definitely have to check that. I don't want to answer based on my memory because my memory might be wrong.
You'd think they would. I mean, I think there's lots of reasons to want to get, you know, people on the weekend, but obviously
Are there
attitudinal questions would be different.
Are there secular holidays in Israel where people don't work, but where they don't work, but it isn't religious? Like Labor Day or something? Could you look at that maybe as a like placebo?
Mm-hmm. So I wonder about that because of sort of the religious nationalism element. Is an event like, you know, Independence Day really going to be, like, would that be secular enough to answer that question? That might be harder to unpack because of the, you know, it's going to be tied in with the founding of a Jewish state.
Sure.
But it's something
There's
to think
no
about.
like Arbor Day or
I have a hard
timing
time
is
imagining
also
Arbor Day changing anyone's views about anything other than maybe planting a tree.
yeah. Well, I'm just saying
But we have
like,
another vote for a placebo
to separate
holiday,
to separate the like weekend not working thing from the religious thing.
It's a little hard to because the Independence Day is comes after the Memorial Day, which is kind of unlike the American Memorial Day, like real, like people really, you know, people take it quite seriously. So
and you don't just go to the beach and eat a picnic or something.
right. So there is kind of a yeah, I don't know. It's also bound up with religious, you know, religious national identity. I don't know. Avital can tell us more about that, but yeah.
Yeah, so the sweet spot would be, and having these things occur during a wave of a survey. That's another part of it.
Right. It's also just one day as opposed to, right,
Yeah.
presumably you have multiple Saturdays.
That's to be day also that people would be taking off work, but our no survey takers are not taking off work to also themselves relax.
This discussion kind of reminded me of some work about like interviewer identity and if it like matches with the respondents, like if they're both Jewish on the Sabbath, maybe they play into that more, whereas if a Christian interviewed a Jew on the Sabbath, they wouldn't feel the need to like play up their religiosity as much. So maybe that's something worth looking into if you can get data on that. I don't know if they would have that available.
I think that might be another one I have to ask the team for when I'm going to email them. I'm going to just email them a raft of questions. Yes, I thought about that. And so in some surveys, you will see the mark, you know, is this person wearing a religious dress or something? I don't think the ESS actually has that level of granular detail because I think for a lot of European countries, it wouldn't be viewed as mattered. They're assuming that most of these are, you know, Christian majority countries. But in some contexts where it does matter, so for instance, in North Africa, if you send a like hijabi interviewer, you do change the responses. And things like that. So it's something that in some surveys is sort of marked in if you've done that. And I can ask them if they marked it in their own sort of read of data or made if they made intentional choices. But I don't know prospectively sort of that they did or did not make choices on that front. But I did think about that when I thought about, you know, the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are just probably not taking this position. Right, they're not going to be the person going and doing the surveys because it's going to specifically say, and you're working on Saturday, which they would not be doing. So it's not that there's no selection. I just am not sure to what degree that selection effect was marked down.
But do you have the language of the interview?
I think these were all done in Hebrew because I subset out the non-Jewish respondents.
So it's
But I can
unlikely
double check
that
that.
the enumerator is not Jewish. Right, I think I would be more
Yeah.
concerned that or like if you were looking at, Palestinian respondents, whether the enumerator is Jewish, but
Right, because that's
I
part
would-
of why I
I would be more
them
surprised.
out.
Yeah.
Right, so same way Christians in Egypt will change their responses if they know that it's a devout Muslim survey asker. I was worried that you would see sort of that kind of censoring, but also just that the Sabbath would mean something very different if you're not Jewish. Right, you're not even supposed to be pretending. There's just no cue there, or you're thinking, great, I can't go to the grocery store because. So in theory, I could also flip it and try to look at the other 25%. I just didn't know if it would have the same sort of interpreted value, and I wasn't making ex ante predictions about them either.
But they may have this information that each country sort of collects the data slightly differently, and then everything gets sent to just the subset that the ESS wants gets sent to them. But they may have information on whether the enumerator was wearing some sort of religious thing, or those kinds of things.
Yeah, so this is going to go into my list of questions for them if it's not marked down. But I think they would have, but it does have the language. I know the survey was offered in Hebrew, Arabic, and I think also Russian.
Another thought that I had, since I can't seem to come up with a placebo holiday for you, is what about placebo survey questions? Like, aren't there some questions that we just don't think would be moved either by weekend effects or by religion, and showing those null effects, I think, would be helpful another way within the data to address some of our concerns. I'm trying to think of a good one. Hannah, I know some of your work is on ethnicity, right? We wouldn't really, you might think that there's a variation, and again, it's two things, right? It's priming because it's the Sabbath or the weekend, but also who's not in the sample. So I'm trying to, it's a very complicated thing to try to parse those two things out. But maybe just throwing that out there. I already got a +1 from Chris Grady. But maybe somebody has any thoughts about what a good placebo question would be, especially those familiar with the ESS.
So the reason I didn't put the ethnicity question in is when I asked the question in my own survey, I did not include two categories that the ESS includes, which is Israeli, and Jewish, because I specifically wanted to get at the discrepancy within the Jewish community on that front. But in the ESS version, those are the two catch-all sort of responses for most people. So what's your ethnicity? I'm Israeli. So I wasn't sure if that would be particularly informative to include. The other one that I included, because I was curious about it, is I checked if they were robust to including political affiliation, but that one I was worried about some post-treatment bias, so it's not included in the models that I showed in the slides, but it also doesn't end up breaking the models anyway. But also because it's sort of less clear that the left-right axis question really works in Israel in the same way that it does in the European countries that were originating that sort of question. So it's robust to it, but it's not clear to me entirely how I wanted to interpret it, so it's not in the models that you see here. I'll have to think around for what would I think of as an unmoved mover that is not a demographic question, because I was already checking sort of the balance of the demographic questions.
One thing about the composition of the sample, I don't know if I didn't look at this, and when you showed the comparison of I would imagine that the Sabbath survey takers would skew younger.
Let's see.
But I could be wrong. I don't know. No, I made a face that maybe he thinks it could be. I guess the non-workers.
I'm curious why? Why do you think that? Because they're working?
Because they're more secular too, on average. old people are more likely to be around on the weekdays during the day. I don't know. That's just my sense. For both reasons, both the weekend reason and the. But people are being served in their homes. Maybe young people would be out and about. I don't know.
I can explore for that. I don't know. That may not have gone into my test for their thing, but I also can just check because I have the data right in front of me. Whether or not there's like that kind of difference. But especially since in theory, it's the, you know, the randomness in some ways, random is helping. But also, no, I don't find a difference in there from just using the year of birth variable into whether or not they were put into the treatment. And of course, because it's measured in 1 year increments, it's like 0.00. Very, very small. But it's, of course, still always worth thinking about. So it looks like age didn't change it. Thank goodness for R. But I'm now wondering about this idea of looking at a weekend effect if I interact sort of employment and taking it on Sabbath. Would that get into that kind of question? Saying, or, you know, the unemployed reacting differently to the Sabbath because they're the ones who aren't switching from work to not working. I know that a lot of the, you know, Sunday models just use work flat out, but now I'm wondering, it wouldn't fully address the question of like everyone else is also off, but it might get somewhat into that point. But either way, it brings me back to my concern then about having Sabbath surveys in general of saying, well, now it's just a different heterogeneous treatment effect. And having sort of the ambient potential treatment is still out there. So I think the question is, how do I get these all to 0? Is there some way I can almost like reverse p-hack this and make it never matter? And I don't know if my reverse p-hacking would be strong enough. Unless we found there's whatever unobserved variable there is, but I like this idea of a placebo question. I'll have to look at the ESS to see what shouldn't move that is not a demographic characteristic. Because otherwise you would expect that to prime, so I'll have to give that a think. Because, well, of course, I didn't find rate effect on some of the variables, even ones that were attitudinal, or they could have been effects, and on the retrospective questions. So maybe more retrospective questions might themselves be a potential space. But then I might be selecting on the fact that I already had one retrospective question come back with a null. So I don't know, then we're getting into like the hypothesizing after knowing space. But, you know, searching for a null result / searching for a potential result where I don't know that there should be one is already going to be in a weird space.
Yeah, I've been using a question, how much do you like watching TV, for a null question, but I feel like that would be, you know, very dependent on whether it's the weekend or weekday. And yeah. I don't think that's asked in the ESS.
I can also do things like their frequency of doing that. The challenge is that turning on the TV would actually be one of the things you can't do.
Oh, you can't? Yeah.
No, because anything that would be starting a fire or completing a task and things like that would be not allowed. And you're both completing a circuit and turning a light on by turning on the TV.
I see.
So I'll have to just explore. It's also going to depend right on what is there, the same way what holidays are in your window. Depends on when they fielded the study. I think closest to a political party is there, but that also, if you're priming a conservative value, could make you feel differently. Those kind of things. So I'll just see how confident I can be about a null, which is a weird space to be in. But I really appreciate it. And I feel like I really lucked out to have people who know a lot about Israel to be here to bring their perspectives on this and give a lot of advice, especially on potential non-placebo holidays. There are a large number, but actually to find out, yes, this idea of like a secular holiday might be hard to achieve. But of course, also we'll just throw this out there for the other sort of cross-national and barometer type studies is many of them do have these sort of weekend effects. And so to think about what that means when we do these surveys. And I'm now wondering if the ANES runs on Sundays, for instance. If there's any Americanists in the audience, maybe you already know. But to sort of frame that into how we think about how we're conducting our surveys.
I wonder, Hannah, if it would be worth, you know, a not very expensive online survey, right? So if you get, you know, if you just focus on people who are willing to go online on the Sabbath, right? Is there sort of an effect? And that's kind of a conservative test, right? Because those are the people who are sort of less, but I mean, they're less likely to go to services, they're less likely to sort of observe, but they're, you know, there might be sort of something, yeah, sort of, you know, that happens. And it would sort of go towards your story, but it would be sort of a conservative test among a subgroup. And it would be, you know, cheap, I think.
Right.
So you could actually sort of design your own thing rather than relying on, you know, what does the ESS have and what does the election study have or something like that.
With the idea of it being compare to subset all of the days, only people who would take a Saturday survey, or to only do the, because I would need a sort of a non-Saturday day to have,
Right.
or non-Friday Saturday to have a non-treated day.
Yeah.
And so asking everyone on Thursday also, oh, but if this were Saturday, would you still be turning your computer on? Or
Oh,
just
I see.
overtly
Yeah.
say only the Hillel should take the survey, which some of the panels can give you.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can find out, right? You can get you can subset in different ways, and you can probably get, you know, I assume that the survey firm knows which of their panelists are able to take surveys on Sabbath, right? So you could sort of subset among those people, right? I mean, presumably they know this.
A quick question, but generally we think about priming not being like necessarily very immediate. Couldn't you think about having a religious priming effect on the day after the Sabbath, right? So I've seen some studies that do something at after Ramadan is over. The idea, I mean, Ramadan is a 30-day prime instead of a 25-hour prime. But it would be interesting to think, like, wouldn't we expect there to see maybe a little bit of a tail of this effect on Sundays? That is the first day of the work week. So we would have the, you know, what we call the Mondays or the Sundays there. So there might be some of that sort of secular effect of just the work week starting. But again, I would think a lot just logically before you even touch data. Don't touch R, but just think to yourself, like, on some of these, what would I expect the secular work week effect and the religious priming effect to go in opposite directions? I think that those are the places that I would put more emphasis on, in addition to finding those placebo tests. But you could also think about, I could have not imagined there would be a survey done on Yom Kippur, but there might be one done like the week right after the high holidays or something, which again, you would expect, if you need some sites of, mostly work in econ that does like the just after Ramadan stuff.
Right.
But you know, that I think I'd find that more interesting to see a Sunday or Monday effect compared to Wednesday, Thursday, you know, nearing the weekend.
Yeah, I think Wednesday, if I had to guess, like Tuesday, Wednesday would probably be like the low point of effect, because I don't really imagine you're starting that many preparations before Thursday. Even if you're thinking this is leading into it, and maybe lasting into Monday, I think might be a bit strong especially if you're not devout, right? Like, so I can look into that, and if not just the number one thing I could think of where that might matter actually would just be the employment question, because while it's overtly a question about gender equality, it still has that element of you're talking about jobs. And so someone going back into work might feel a little differently about that when they're literally thinking about their job that day of the week. So that's one where I might anticipate an effect. But then I would start wondering if it's going to be women will want equality and men would want them not to have it, if it's going to be a question about who gets the job. So that might still, and then I might be walking myself to like a three-way interaction and regretting that choice. So I'll have to think about it a bit more. In terms of doing an online survey, you're right, Israeli panels are relatively cheap compared to sort of Arab state panels. But the online access to the ultra-Orthodox is somewhat constrained just because they're not generally joining the panels at nearly the same kind of rates. So I'd probably be getting more of a sample that has a lot more of people who are secular, but also religious or traditional. You can get a sort of large enough rates. So I am taking the top off of it in that way, of it being the most religious, or is the most conservative in their interpretation of religiosity. I'll say it that way because there's of course very religious people who are just not ultra Orthodox. Would be taking some of that off the top. So it would be probably, you're right, like a more conservative test of it. Although in that sense, I almost wonder if what I'm doing even now if we assume that the ultra Orthodox, and I can't test this with ESS because they don't ask, aren't taking a Sabbath survey, I'm still then moving a lot of the really religious people off treatment, which means if that's what's happening and I can't test it, I should be then less likely to see a Sabbath effect because the ultra Orthodox are got to be perpetually primed. And so that I think even might work against finding an effect. But it's something I could think about in running my own survey. And then I might even be able to see how close they let me get to one of the high holidays. I can't turn IRB around fast enough to hit Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur this year, but I could look for something else, maybe something closer to Passover or something, and see what I can hit. And that also, it's a week, so it is a bit more of a stronger prime than Yom Kippur or something. So something to think about for the spring. So thank you guys so much. That's a lot of very helpful comments and a lot for me to think about.
Any last questions? Okay, well, thank you, Hannah, for presenting this, and we look forward to seeing the results published in a paper in the near future, and hopefully we can all learn something from that. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. We'll have the next WISM October 9th, I believe, with Chris Aiken.
19th. Sorry, I have your email next to me.
Oh, okay.
October 19th.
Thanks. So we'll see you then.
And thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Bye-bye.